Hey folks, this is Paul talking about A Course in Miracles. Um, got an interesting theory to put forward to you today because um, I've been having a whole bunch of insights lately about the Course and about how it's structured and what's talking about what. And it's caused me to realize something that I didn't see before, relating to worlds and perceptions and where you are at a given time and what you're seeing and so on. And I've come up with a potentially quite useful model of what the structures in the Course are that's different to all of the ones that I've seen and heard before. And I'm hoping that you'll see that it makes a lot of sense and brings a lot of clarity and ties up some loose ends, because there's some people that believe that God made this world, and there's some people that believe that he didn't. And in those two systems of thinking, we've tended to come up with kind of opposition in those two viewpoints. And there's some things that one group of people say that does have some validity, and there's some things that the other group seems to say that has some validity. And so you tend to get this sort of conflict going on between these two groups, these two ways of interpreting the Course, and they can't seem to be reconciled. So what this new idea is going to do is to allow them to be reconciled, because there's another way of looking at this. So for example, like in, I think, a workbook lesson, it says something like, God is in the world I see because God is in my mind. In the viewpoint that God is not in the world, and God didn't make the world, and perception is always a perception of a dream, sort of saying like God is up here in heaven and he's always in heaven, and here down here is the world, and God is never down here in the world. So it seems to sort of create a problem, because it does say that you can see God. God is in everything I see, and you're trying to become able to see God, and look at a table or whatever and see God in it, which to some people then would imply the world, the physical world of objects and bodies, somehow has God in it, and that you can see God in it. And that gives, or seems to imply, that somehow God is sort of behind or making this world. And some people have leaned towards those kind of quotes and statements, taking them to mean that it seems to give some credit to the idea that you can experience God in some way while you're in the world. And of course, that's a big component of seeing the world as forgiven and holy, seeing holiness in it, and so on. And then there's this other view that I've been very drawn to for the most part, where you're sort of saying, okay, this dream world is a sort of self-contained thing, and God is in another world in heaven. There's no perception in heaven, so that seems to suggest you can't see God. And that sort of cuts you off a little bit from these other components in the Course, talking about how you can see God in things that you see. And the two things are sort of, neither of them are quite complete, because if you're going to have this idea of what is the Course saying, what is it meaning, ideally you want to encompass everything. You want to include every single thing that the Course says without contradicting a single thing, and having no exceptions or loopholes or things that aren't accounted for, or things that seem to imply things that don't seem to fit. So it's kind of like both of those views are not quite correct. Neither of them accommodates every single thing the Course says. Neither of them quite explains some of the statements that Jesus makes that really seem to say something else. Like being able to see God in the world doesn't seem compatible with that you cannot remain in the world with this knowledge, and there's no perception in heaven, and so on. And so we need a different model that encompasses everything in the Course. And I'm getting to where I'm seeing what this model is, because it's not quite either of those two previous models. Now, here's where I want to start with this. There are many references to the real world. Most people traditionally have believed that when the Course talks about the real world, it's talking about this kind of a sort of almost a place in between the dream world of illusions and reality, like it's some kind of sort of in-between buffer or a place that you can be where, as the Course says, the real world still is but a dream, meaning that even though it seems somehow real, it's still a dream, and yet it's not being fully in the dream. So then what that implies now is that you've got three kind of worlds. You've got the sort of the world of perceiving illusions, you've got this real world, and then you've got heaven. And because some of the wording in the Course seems to sound like it's talking about the real world as being sort of a bridge or an in-between state, that can imply that the real world is not heaven. Okay, so what most people have come to conclude based on that is that references to the real world are talking about sort of a real version of this world hidden behind the illusions that is not heaven. Now, I think that is not logically sound, because you can't have three worlds. You can't have these kind of sort of two worlds and then a sort of a weird blob in the middle. It's not clean, it's not nice and tidy, it's not logically accurate, because you should have reality and the opposite of reality. You should not have three states, really. There should only be something that's real and something that's not real. So there's only two worlds. Excuse me for blowing. So what I thought is, and like there's a statement talking about the real world that talks about, in the real world there's no streets and no buildings and no places where people buy things they don't need, and there's no day and night, so there's no sun. And to me, that is not talking about this world in any way, because in that view there is no physicality, there's no space-time, there's no planets and stars. So it's really talking, that reference to the real world, it even refers to the real world, is really, if you're clear about it, it's talking about heaven. It is talking about God's creation and God's world outside the dream. So not all references to the real world in the Course are necessarily talking about this kind of a place within dreaming or whatever, the sort of the almost in reality but not quite there. Not all the references to the real world refer to a place that sounds like it's in this world. So what that led me to seeing is, and this has been my theory for a little while now, is that Jesus would have to be kind of mistaken in his choice of words if he referred to the real world as something that ultimately is not real. The real world still is but a dream seems to say that it isn't really real. It's sort of relatively real. It's more real than the illusions that you were believing. And that was how I interpreted it before. But I don't think Jesus is that unclear. I don't think he would use words that don't really have a solid meaning behind them that people can generally accept and relate to as an accurate choice of words. I think he knows what he's talking about. So he chose to refer to the real world. What if those references to the real world are actually accurate and are talking about reality? What if the real world really is heaven? What if the real world is an appropriate term for the actually real world? Reality, heaven, God's creation, the kingdom of God. What if the real world is a synonym for the kingdom of God? And then you would have reality as the real world, appropriately named, and then you'd have the illusion, the dream, as the unreal world, which is much more logically clean and sound. You've got reality and its opposite, and that's all. If that were true, and I think that it is, that then reframes a whole bunch of stuff. And it gives a bunch of stuff a different meaning, because now when Jesus refers to the real world in ways that sound like they're talking about perception or being in this kind of intermediary place, it lends a different meaning to it. So he also refers to it as the borderland. So I read up on what the borderland is yesterday, and it talks about how the borderland is outside the gates of heaven. Therefore, that puts it kind of inside the dream, and it's the same thing as true perception. And he says it's not a place, but it's a meeting place between the two worlds, almost like you've got this world, and this is kind of where they touch. That it's not a spatial location, like a separate place. It's just sort of a state where you're almost outside of the ego thought system. You're just teetering on the edge, and that's what he calls the borderland, but it's not really a place. So, and he says that the borderland is the same thing as his reference to the real world. So in some places he refers to the real world as that borderland kind of state, but elsewhere he speaks of the real world as actual reality. Otherwise his terminology becomes confusing. Why did he choose to call it the real world if it's not real? So with that in mind, and keeping in mind that there are some things where he talks about God is in the world I see, and because he's in my mind, and you can see holiness, and there's a part where it talks about perception can reach everywhere under the Holy Spirit's guidance, meaning that and implying that you can perceive everywhere, literally everywhere, not just in the dream, as if somehow you can perceive heaven, that you could have a perception of reality that isn't quite the same thing as knowledge of and being in reality, like a direct immersion, communion in reality, but because it says perception is a separated state, and those who perceive still need healing, but that you could in some way use perception to look at reality. There's a quote that talks about how you can see the Son of God. The Son of God is in heaven. The Son of God is in reality. How is it possible that you can see reality? If perception is only kind of like you confine it, you put it in a box of this world and say, I can only perceive the illusory world, or I can only have perceptions of the illusion dream world, and that you can never perceive heaven. It does say that there is no perception in heaven. Gone is perception. Nothing there is seen, only known. When you're in it, like you're squarely, directly in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot use perception when you're outside of it to look at it, kind of from the outside. Because there are quite a few quotes that do say you can see the Son of God, perception can reach everywhere, you can perceive the real world. And so if we sort of tie this all together, you kind of get to a place where it seems to now give you the impression that it's talking about kind of a window shopping scenario where this world is illusion, and you're kind of in, let's say you're in a room with no windows, and you're inside the room with no windows and perceiving with the body, and you're seeing the interior surface of this room, this prison that you've made, and not seeing past the walls, because there's also all these statements talking about how the granite block of sin, or the wall of separation, or whatever, is physical matter. It is the sight of form. It is you're blinded by perception of form. You can't look if you're blinded, but you're not looking past the physical, and so with the body's eyes. And so if you're in a room with no windows and you're looking at the walls and your sight is stopping at the walls, you can't see past the walls. But later on he talks about how forgiveness is overlooking, reason sees past the forms of error, and you can look somehow past the wall, the granite block, the veil of illusions, which is this world. The physical world illusion is this veil over the face of Christ that you can look past, see past, and to look at Christ. So it's actually talking about, hey, you can have a perception of Christ, who is in heaven. And I always thought before that the face of Christ would have to mean some kind of like surface layer on the outside of heaven, that you sort of look at a poster that advertises Christ and isn't him. But what if you actually could perceive Christ directly. So you're in a room with no windows and you're blinded by perception of form, can't see outside the room. You're having false perception. What if you wear away at some of the walls, you use some tools to chip away at the walls and gradually create a hole and make a window, and now you're in the room, in the physical world, having perception, looking through the room, past the walls, through the window, because the veil of illusions has become transparent. And it does become, Jesus says, the veil becomes thin before you see the face of Christ. So what if it's like you're in a room that is like a physical illusion, and you make a window, and now you're looking through, you're overlooking the walls by looking through them like you would through a window, and now you see something out of the window on the other side of the window. You see, what do you see? What is, the world was made to cover up reality. The world, the veil of illusions, the separation dream was made to block your sight and to make it so you cannot see the real world, reality, heaven, Christ, Son of God and God. So if you make a window in your world whereby you're not blinded by sight of form, and you can, with a kind of X-ray vision, kind of see through the illusion, not be deceived by it, not be tempted by it, you can now overlook the illusory world and start seeing, as if seeing through a window, what is beyond the world. That reality is outside the world, because you're in heaven dreaming of exile. You have this little bubble in heaven where you're hiding inside the little bubble, making a wall around it, a little room with no windows where you're trapped and hiding in darkness. And as you put some windows in your room, you become able to see past the walls of the room and see that you're in heaven. That you're no longer trapped in the room. That you can actually have perception of reality. You can see heaven, you can see Christ, you can see the Son of God, and you can see God. So what that then means is that now it makes more sense to say God is in everything I see, because God's in my mind, because what you're trying to do there is you're learning to look past the illusion of the form, the surface appearance of nothing, to be able to see something that's beyond it. Unity is not a thing of dreams. It is clearly beyond the dream, and surely theirs. This is something like that. That you can look at a table and you can see that there isn't just a table there. You sort of see past the table and start seeing something else that was hidden by the illusion of the appearance of the table, and now you're starting to see God, because God is not in the table, but the table is in this room trying to block your vision, and you're starting to see past the table to see reality. So the whole thing about vision, having Christ's vision and true perception, is that you're becoming able to see. that you, in your body vision, in your body's eye, use of the body's eyes, they're not really seeing. These eyes were made not to see. They're made to fixate on the walls in the room and not see past the outside surface of nothing and be blinded by sight of form. So, but Christ's vision, you develop this other way of looking that is spiritual vision, spiritual eye, that overlooks everything the body looks at, is not blinded by it, sees through it, and therefore can look upon what is behind or hidden by the physical, which is reality, is God, is Christ. So that means you're becoming able to see reality. And there's a part in there, somebody quoted this recently about how you can only really see with Christ's vision that which actually exists. Now, that's a problem for the old model because there's no way to say how that works. It almost blurs the line between the two levels, that you can only really see what is really there, what it really exists. And God is the only creator of what really exists. So what that's then saying is that perception can see the real creation of God. It can see heaven. It can see reality. True perception can look upon what really exists. Because it can look from within the room, through the window, to what is outside of the room. And it can actually look directly at God, reality, what exists, heaven, creation, the kingdom of God, that you literally can see reality, and reality is the real world. So what this is doing is, whereas before we had, okay, here's reality in God's kingdom, and then there's a separation, and then we're on the other side of the separation, and now you're sort of stuck in this place, and you're having perception, and it seems like you can only perceive this, and there's this little sort of weird real world thing, and then there's the kingdom, which you can only have knowledge of and not perception of, which kind of separates the two layers and puts a buffer in between that sort of suggests you cannot really see outside of the dream, and heaven is this other place, and there's sort of no overlap, and there's no way then in that view to be in the world seeing holiness or love or light, and then that leads you to false conclusions about, and a sort of an attitude, like I had this attitude of just kind of the whole everything in the world is bullshit and get rid of it, and I'm not exactly undoing that, but it is illusion. But if you put kind of a ceiling on the room, and now you've put heaven on the second layer of the building, and you can't seem to get to it until you kind of like pop out of the dream and go into reality, that doesn't seem to line up with what the Course says in various places. And so this new model, where you can be in the dream, looking past the dream to what's outside of the dream, by making the dream transparent as the thin veil covering the face of Christ, works much better and far more accurately and with no exceptions to all the things the Course says, and now allows you to see that heaven and its light, which are behind the physical world in a sense, outside is a bigger container, can become visible, can be seen with perception while still dreaming. And that then brings, if you have so you had a glass ceiling and heaven is up here on the second layer, that now means that while you're down here stuck in the dream world, you can look at past the ceiling. You can start seeing the light, you can start seeing love, you can start seeing God from here. And the light of heaven can be now recognized as shining from heaven upon this world. And there are other quotes and statements talking about how heaven, you can reflect heaven's light in the dream. The light of heaven can shine on the world. The heaven is all laid across the world, but you don't see it, and so on. That you can bring the light of holiness in you and shine it into the dream world. That is only really possible if you accept that the ceiling between the two worlds is transparent, and so God, heaven's light and love can shine into, down upon, and infuse the dream with light. And that's part of how eternity shines away the world. The light there's some things talking about how light has to bring the light into the world, in a sense, even though some people say that sounds wrong. It's not that you're actually capable of removing it from heaven and shoving it into the dream. It's that the light is in heaven, shining on the dream, and can shine away the illusions. And so that brings heaven closer to the people in the dream who are trying to do forgiveness and everything, doing the workbook and all this stuff, developing Christ's vision. It brings heaven closer because instead of thinking overcoming illusions in this world, and I'm not really in heaven, I'm not going to be in heaven until I pop out of the dream, I'm not going to be able to really experience heaven until I get out of dreaming. It now makes it possible for you to kind of say that you can without actually breaking the levels, the light from the higher level of heaven can shine into the lower level, that you could see lovely reality in a body, that you could still be in a body and perceive heaven. Everywhere you look, you could see God in everything because you're temporarily seeing with the body's vision and also overlooking it and seeing past the physical and seeing God. And that old model, or both of them, don't really accommodate that because it kind of removes heaven a bit further away, that you're never going to really, you can never really see it, or you can never really fully experience it until you get into it by leaving the dream, which is still true. You still have to leave the body and leave perception behind and literally get out of the room to be able to be in awareness of heaven. But because the walls and the ceiling in the room become more transparent over time, by your forgiving of them, you're not believing in them, your ability to overlook them, look past the walls and the ceiling, the world gradually disappears or becomes transparent and vanishes in your sight as a result of you becoming able to see the other world. This also is supported by parts where it talks about you cannot see two worlds, and some people have interpreted that talking as if it's talking about false perception and true perception, as if there's the difference between being in this world and either seeing it wrong or seeing it correctly, as if those are the two worlds. But in this new model, the false perception is all of this level, this dream world, physical, And true perception allows you to see out of the dream. That the other world, when it talks about two worlds, the other world is heaven. It is not this little thin idea of a real world thing. It is actually another world, and that world is heaven. The first world that God created is heaven. The world you made is hell, is this physical world. And this is also supported by the fact that he says the world is false perception. Meaning that if you look at and see anything physical, anything that is a body, a planet, a star, whatever physical forms, walls of sin, you're failing to overlook them. This is why to see a sinless body is impossible. And therefore, all of this physical world is false perception. Seeing only it is the same thing as saying, I only see the inside walls of my room, there are no windows, and I'm stuck looking at the interior surface of this fake world and not seeing past it. And therefore, that's what the body's eyes were made to see, to only look at the inside surface and to not see past anything. So that means that everything physical, the entire physical world, if you see it and you don't look past it, you are in false perception, meaning that it kind of only exists in false perception. It's sort of in this, the whole world is a false perception realm where everything in it is false, right? And that makes it much clearer that you took what was true and made an opposite world, which is entirely false. Everything in this world is false when you see it, and if you only see it, you're having false perception. In order to develop true perception, it's nothing to do with looking at this world. It is to do with looking outside of the realm of false perception at the truth. True perception looks outside of the dream at reality. It all fits together so nice and cleanly, and it accommodates and includes everything that I've seen in the course on every subject relating to this. There doesn't seem to be any exclusion or exception. Nothing is unclear, nothing is confusing, because it's more accurate than the old models of how we used to sort of interpret, this is what the course means, here's the levels, and here's what perception can do, and so on. It does require accepting that this world, the physical world, is an illusion. The world you see is an illusion of a world. God did not create it. The world is false perception. You have to accept that in this model, because the world is the interior surface of the room with no windows. And if you're looking at it and seeing it at all, you are blinded by perception of form. You're seeing illusions. The body's eyes were made to see illusions, to only see illusions, and they will never see anything else. So if you're only using the body's eyes and you're seeing bodies and trees and houses, you have not fully become able to look at reality with true perception. And this also requires accepting then that true perception looks outside of the dream. It is not a way of looking at the dream. It is overlooking, because atonement and forgiveness are the same thing. To forgive is to overlook Therefore, forgiveness literally overlooks the whole world and looks out of the world, past the world, beyond the world, to another world. And I didn't finish what I was saying about there's two worlds. You cannot see both worlds. Sight of one is costing you sight of the other, because each one requires a different kind of perception and or vision, and the one kind of vision denies the other kind of vision. Physical body sight based on photons that cannot bounce off anything other than surfaces and make you blind and unable to see through things, because the photons hit the surface and then bounce off. Okay, you see this wall because there's light particles hitting the wall and going into your eyeballs, so that your body eyes can see, can be blocked by what is there. And being blocked by physical objects is what we call seeing, which is quite funny because it's obviously a state where you're not able to look past things. You're blinded by perception of form. I'm looking at this camera and I can't see past it. I can't see what's behind it because I stop at the surface of nothingness and I can't see through the camera. I can't see through my hands because that's not real seeing. Fake seeing or false perception, which the body's eyes have and are fixed in, always stop at the surface and can't see through anything. They do not overlook. To forgive is to overlook. True perception, forgiveness, salvation, atonement are all one thing, synonyms for this state of mind of perfect true perception that overlooks what the body did not overlook, meaning that if the body hits the surface of things and can't see past physical matter, forgiveness does overlook surfaces of things. It does not fall for illusions. It can see through the walls of the prison. It can see through the box. It can see outside the box. It can see through the room as if the room has become transparent, and it can see everywhere, unlimited. Not ever stopped by form, never blocked by form. The physical world is a block to awareness. Physical matter and objects are blocks to awareness. You have to become able to not believe your eyes and see past them to what Jesus says is another world. And it's not another world as in, well, I see what people used to call the real world. It's sort of like I'm still seeing this world, but there's sort of a oneness. I still see the objects, but they're still sort of one blended thing. That's not what it means. It means I literally can look at another world. I can look outside of the world that I'm in. I can look outside of the room that I'm in through the transparent veil, through the windows, and I can see an opposite world that must be heaven, because earth and heaven are opposites. So it supports that too. This way of looking at the Course's structures and what happens in perception and what you're capable of perceiving, if you have it now mean, if you see this world, that is false perception. Any kind of spiritual vision, Christ vision, true perception is looking out of this world, beyond this world. Your brother's reality is beyond his body, seeing out of the dream from within it. This is the new interpretation. I encourage you to think about it, because I'm quite pleased with this view of the Course's model, because nothing contradicts it in the Course. There's no confusions, there's no statements that don't quite fit. it makes a lot of sense. So for me, that is good as well, because now I realize that while I'm here in the dream inside the room, I can be looking at physical things, and what's behind those physical things is heaven. It's not just like the real world, true perception of this world, kind of a sort of a standing on the outskirts of the world, borderland kind of thing, still being outside of heaven, completely 100% not in heaven. It's more of a way of saying, here's the world, here's heaven. Heaven actually overlaps with the world. The world is this seeming box that we are in. Heaven is not actually like a separate box that is separated off in a completely that you cannot in any way access it whatsoever when you're in the dream. But rather that heaven is this realm that is perfect and outside of the dream, in a sense, so they seem to be separate, but it also encompasses everywhere, everything. So when you look past, when you're in the dream looking past the walls, you're going to start seeing some of heaven. So that means that as you're in this world, waking up, doing forgiveness, heaven is behind what my body's eyes are looking at. And as I forgive the world, which means overlook the world, it doesn't mean I'm going to keep the physical world and be nice to it. It doesn't mean that you're going to keep on looking at the world and regarding it as real. Some people believe that when you have false perception, it means that you're having false perceptions about this world, as if you're in the room having a misinterpretation of the room. And that when you get to true perception, you're in the room still, having a correct perception of the inside walls of the room. And that upon seeing the inside walls of the room, you're looking at the real version of this world, and that it is real. And there's nothing outside the room. This is what some people believe, and it's not correct, in my opinion. It is not acknowledging the way that forgiveness overlooks the world. It's not acknowledging that the whole world is false perception, and therefore if false perception goes, the whole world must go. Jesus talks about how a forgiven world cannot last. A forgiven world is an overlooked world. It's a world that has become transparent. It's a world that you've become able to see through. It's a world that no longer seems solid. Jesus talks about how as you have more guilt, the world seems more solid. The veil of illusions covering your vision that makes your body see seems to become solid and real as a result of being in guilt. And when the guilt is gone, the world lightens up and thins out and becomes transparent, and eventually the veil parts completely, meaning that everything that was the veil is gone. The world is gone. There is no world, is referring to this physical world because it's an illusion of a world. It isn't real. It's like saying the inside of the room is reality. And if I would just, if I'm here in my ego and I'm looking at the inside of the room incorrectly, I'm having false perception. If I look at the inside of the room correctly, I'm having true perception, and I'm seeing the reality and the truth of the room. But the room isn't real. And people have thought that the inside of this world is the universe, it's reality, and that you can look at it and see it. And then they've sided with some of those statements that say that you can see reality, you can see the Son of God, you can see holiness, God is in the world that you see, and have used that to justify that position of believing that you can be inside a box and believe the box is real. And it is failing to acknowledge the other portion that people have thought cannot mean what it seems to mean because it seems to contradict that model. And so you've had like these two camps in A Course in Miracles community where a lot of people believe in this, the box is real, the room is real, but it's just my perception of it that needs to change so that I can see its real nature. Versus the other people who have been focusing on the box isn't real, there is no room, there's only reality, and having to also then, because these are being separated, this is ego thinking, has led to denial of some of the parts of the Course where it seems to be saying that you can see God in things and that you can have a perception of holiness and you can see the Son of God with perception. So in that model, you have to then deny other chunks of the Course. And there's been a long-term war between these two camps of people. Some people like to keep, because it all starts with the premise, either the room is real or it's not. Either God created the room or he didn't. Those are the two logical camps, and that's the foundational premise, that the only options that you got to choose from. And some people have chosen to believe that the room is not God's creation. Some believe the room is God's creation. Because both of those views are not really quite complete, because they polarize and separate in that kind of thinking. And now you've got you have to kind of deny some of the pieces in the Course in both positions, because they're not all-encompassing views. Which doesn't mean God made the world. It's actually true that the room is not real. The model of God made the world is false. The world is an illusion of a world. God did not create it. The world you made is the room. And so the model that adjusts to that premise and comes up with conclusions and sides with the quotes that seem to say it's just my perception about the world that needs to change in order to see it as it really is and accept its holiness and have the world be holy and beautiful, that is wrong. But you can't also invalidate some of those quotations that Jesus has given that those people latch onto that have validity. And God can be in everything you see, because you can be in the room looking out the window past the illusion of form and seeing God. So you can actually see God in stuff that you see, and that's actually what I experienced when I had an experience of God, that God did appear to be in everything, and I could still see the forms because I still had body-eye perception, but I temporarily went into some kind of Christ vision thing and could see past the physical illusions and see that there was an unconditional love, a sea of total equality and omnipresence everywhere, kind of mixed in with the perceptions of the physical. But that didn't mean to me that the world was God, and some people have interpreted it to mean the formlessness of God creates forms. Not true either. That God is the creator of the world, that somehow he is behind the world creating it. Not true. And so what I saw was in experience, and some other people have had experiences that we can't invalidate just on the basis of some theory. And this newer model does seem to incorporate and respect and make room for those experiences where you can be in the world seeming to have an experience of God, or at least very close to a full experience of God, that you can be in the world and not of it. You can be in the world in a body not being awake from the dream, still being in the dream, not being quite squarely in heaven, but having almost the maximum experience of heaven while still being in the world. And that is much more supportive of what people experience. It's more supportive of becoming happier in the dream and not attacking the world so much, and not having kind of like a cold nihilistic attitude. That kind of like you can still be in the world for a while and switch on the lights from outside the room and have the light shining on the world, and you can see it. You can see past the illusions and see the light of heaven upon the earth, not as the earth, transcendent of the earth, and realize that you're actually becoming able to look at heaven. And heaven's reality is hidden behind the physical forms. And so you're gradually going to increase your ability to look past illusions and overlook physical bodies and start seeing reality, light, loveliness showing up in your perception as a result of you looking past the world and looking at another world, and starting to transition from false perception that only sees this world to true perception that looks out of this world at another world. And I've always kind of felt that this lines up more correctly with that when you're looking with true perception and wanting to have a happier experience and see a better world of love, you're looking at heaven. You're not finding love because it's in the physical layer. You're not seeing love because the physical world is love. You're seeing past the physical world and looking at another world. And so as your love is increasing and you're wanting to experience whatever in a more loving way, and you want to see more light, it's not because the physical world is becoming more light. It's not because the physical world itself is ceasing to be physical, and it's not because the physical world's laws change. The world is still run by the ego. The world is false perception, and the ego thought system is making the world. So we have to get out of the I'm going to turn the physical world into heaven, because that is not overlooking. A forgiven world cannot last, because you have to forget the physical world. If you forgive the world, this physical world, it should mean I overlook the world, I see past it, I've forgotten it, and it's not real. I'm not deceived by it. Teachers of God choose to remain in the dream for a while. They look upon dreams a while, but they're not deceived by what they see. And being deceived by the physical world is false perception. If you want to have true perception, therefore, you need to not be deceived by the physical world, and you need to be looking at something else. But a lot of people are trying to keep looking at the surface of the physical and want it to become heaven on earth. They want it to turn into love. And in a sense, it should look different because your perception past it doesn't take it as seriously. And so it becomes lighter, and it becomes thinner, and it becomes less, you see less reality to the sin that it's based on. The world of bodies is the world of sin. The world was made as an attack on God. The world is a picture of the crucifixion of God's Son. The world is false perception. The physical stuff is an illusion. You're not supposed to be trying to turn that illusory world into a form of heaven as such. You're supposed to be just letting the world be what it is, and what it is not real. It's not a real room. And instead, shifting your focus and your attention, looking away from the physical layer of illusion, and putting your attention on heaven. That if you look at and stop your vision at physical objects, you are looking at the illusion. You're looking at the physical false perception world. True Christ vision does not look at this world. It looks away from the world, overlooks the world, looks at Christ, looks at the Son of God, looks at God, looks at heaven, bypasses the world. And it's that view of that lovely vision of Christ that you're falling in love with, and you're trying to become more able to see that reality and forget the stupid world that you made. Instead of trying to turn the world into heaven, it's not. You're not supposed to keep looking at it. You're supposed to forget it. And the world is supposed to vanish. Eternity shines away the world. The world will spin into the nothingness from which it came. It is nothing. Heaven is everything. You're supposed to go from this blind vision of I'm only going to look at the bodies and put your attention back on God. To stop looking at the shit and forget it. Let it go. The world is not real. And that's what the meaning of there is no world is. This entire spectrum of physical objects is not real, does not exist. It's a dream. All of it is false perception. Wanting to keep it, wanting to retain it, being in love with it is special love. Wanting to idolize it, worship it, it's the world of idols. Wanting to keep it and have your sunsets and your puppies and kittens and your cream cakes and keep that stuff while trying to be in full reality is not possible. But some people are trying to do that because they have this model of the room is real. This whole universe, which is the room, seems to be real, and everything in the room seems to be real. And it's not. There's more. Heaven is a bigger container than this universe. Space-time is an illusion. There is no space, there is no time. They are both made to oppose reality. Space is the opposite of omnipresence. Time is the opposite of eternity. because you're in heaven dreaming of exile. So you're in this really big container, God's being, having a little bubble dream of exile, a little container inside the container. Heaven is outside in a sense, but it's also here as well. It's in the room and outside the room because it's everywhere. So you're always in heaven. Heaven is here now. But if you're inside that room looking at the walls and not seeing past the walls, you're not going to be able to see heaven. And that's why the walls of the illusory world have to become transparent so that you can look past illusions and see heaven. So true perception is a perception of Christ. It is a direct perception of heaven. When you get to that and you see the face of Christ, which I always thought meant something outside of heaven, like a sort of a surface layer, it's really that you're actually seeing Christ with perception, seeing Christ in your brothers with perception. A direct ability to look at what seems to be a perception of Christ. But that's actually slightly different from what Christ is, because Christ can really only be known and not seen correctly. So when you see Christ through the dream walls, and you're looking at it, it says that your vision of the world disappears. The world is forgotten, and for a moment you don't even see anything false. The false world of false perception disappears from your sight because you've become so focused on looking at God's reality, looking at heaven with perception, that you're looking straight at Christ, and therefore you don't have any falseness in your perceiving, so you don't see with the body's eyes anymore, and the world vanishes from your sight, and you're looking at Christ with perception. And that is why it says the Holy Spirit loves to look upon Christ, because he is using perception to look at Christ, who is in reality in heaven. So it's clearly possible, because the Holy Spirit loves to look upon Christ all the time with his perception. It's a pretty big clue that perception must be able to see outside of the dream. And that forgiveness is all about looking past the dream and becoming able to see again, that you're blinded by the room, and you're going to want to get rid of the walls so that you can see what's really here, which is heaven, reality, Christ. So then you see Christ, and upon seeing Christ, you're now so close to the immersive experience of being Christ that it's easy to transition to total reality, which is leaving the dream world, leaving the world of false perception, leaving the physical world, leaving the body, getting out of dreaming, finishing dreaming, stopping dreaming, and waking up in reality, which you were perceiving before, but now perception itself goes away. Because perception has many limitations, and perception is fundamentally unstable, it's judgmental, it is interpretative, it's selective, it's variable, it fluctuates, it's not, it lacks the stability and certainty of knowledge and direct cognition, direct immediate communion with God and Christ. So perception of Christ that you can have is, Jesus calls it an image, a reflection of heaven, that seems to be like a face, because it seems to be an image or a dream perceived interpretation of Christ that your mind is seeing. But Jesus talks about how there is a difference between seeing that image and actually going and being in heaven fully, where Christ is not a image, it's a condition, and you experience it totally. So perception is not really a way to fully directly experience anything. It's a bit removed. Perception is a separated state. Perception is inside dreaming. But you can be at the very edges of the dream, with the dream being very transparent, and looking through the walls of the dream at Christ, and see Christ from inside the dream with an interpretative mechanism in your mind, and therefore perceive Christ. You can perceive heaven. But it's not quite the same as ending perception, getting totally out of dreaming, which is waking up in reality, waking up from the dream. So when you have true perception and you have perception of the Christ, face of Christ, you're not quite awake. You can be in a body in the world, being a teacher of God, seeming to be very close to awakening, but you are not fully awake if you're in a body. The body cannot stay without illusions. Jesus says, my body disappeared because I had no illusions about it. You cannot remain in the world with this knowledge. So the difference is that you first become able to look through and past this illusory world. You become able to see heaven. You see Christ and God everywhere. You literally are looking at God. God is in everything I see. And then, so now your perception is allowing you to sort of be in this level, but to go past the separation and look at what's on the other side of the separation from inside dreaming. And now you can see God's reality through a perceptual system which slightly has issues, because perception is not knowledge, and it was made to perceive the truth is not the same as knowing it. Perception is based on images and reflections and interpretations. It's not quite direct immersion, communion, knowing. So then you let go of the realm of perception, you let go of body, world, all perception entirely, all walls, all bodies are gone in the blazing light of the Son of God, and then you finally wake up fully expanded to infinity in heaven's reality. You are seeing sort of a window shopping version first. You're outside of the kingdom, looking at through the windows of the kingdom, looking at what's in heaven. And now you go into the store, and being in the store is being in the kingdom. It is being fully awake. It is the only full, total awakening. But you had become so willing to line yourself up with it before, when you were in perception, that you're now very, very close to knowledge of it, and you're very ready for it. And of course you couldn't be ready for that unless you had become, in your perceiving, your mind had become very corrected and truthful and close to awakening before you left the dream. So that's why you have to get to this happy dream where you've become relatively whole and healed and almost fully awake in a body, and then are ready for the resurrection and to go past the walls and get out of the room and to finally leave the prison. And enlightenment is not a change, but is a recognition, but not a change. You then realize where you are and where you've always been, which is heaven's reality. You were sort of, so it can seem as though you're sort of in heaven while you're in the world, because so long as you're having some truth in your perceiving, even if it's not totally false perception, if there's a little bit, Jesus talks about how tolerance of pain is not without limits, and then at some point everybody gets to where they seek a better way, and that's the start of the development of the spiritual eye, which is true perception, the eye that can look at spirit. And so long as you're starting to go towards God, you're starting to see through the illusions of the world. So that means there's going to be some degree of awareness of heaven, or perception of love or light or whatever while you're here, and it's going to increase to overflowing, where you're in the dream as a teacher of God who is performing miracles and loving everybody, and doesn't take the world as real, and has overlooked it so much that it is not deceiving them. They don't believe in it. They may still see it just enough as the thin veil to be, with the body's eyes, to be able to go help people and recognize calls for love and healing. And then at some point get so close to reality that you go past the walls and you leave the dream and you wake up in reality. So I think this is a much more accurate and all-encompassing and clear way to look at the structures in the Course and the differences between the worlds and how perception works. And so far I haven't found anything that has contradicted it in the quotes. It has included portions of the Course that didn't quite add up. It has kind of made a bigger umbrella, and has, for me, cleared up a whole bunch of stuff and reframed things, and now I can see how some things make sense and what they must really be meaning, that I can be in the dream and have a way to see God while I'm having a dream, because forgiving true perception literally sees past and through the physical universe and can look at reality that is behind the world. And so that brings reality closer, because now that means I can interact with it and I can have a relationship developing with it and see it, and have it become my new truth and recognize it as a replacement for this other world that I've been looking at, and while I'm transitioning to it, rather than, okay, I'm going to have to do all this stuff and get to this high level, and then all of a sudden it's going to flip a switch and I'm going to suddenly be aware of heaven that I was never aware of before. It brings the light and the love into the dream more, and it lets you access it while you're in process, and acknowledges that you can have Jesus even says you can have visions of God. Those visions don't necessarily last because they're based in perception, but you can see God. And the only way to make that make sense is to say that that room of physicality that you're in has to be able to become transparent and see through, and your perception has to become able to look outside the dream at reality. Otherwise, none of this stuff adds up. It doesn't make sense. So I'm kind of happy about that because it also has the potential to unite the two camps in A Course in Miracles, whereby the people who are picking up on some of the key parts about this world being real, that still is not true, but they pick up on some of the parts about being able to experience in some degree and way God's presence in this world, that you can see God in things, and you can become more appreciative or whatever while you're in this. And the people who are more, let's just get rid of the world and do nothing with it, and it's all you can't do anything with God while you're here, you might as well just wait till the end kind of thing. Merge those two together with this model that allows what's up here to infuse what's down here. And it seems to be what Jesus is saying in the Course, because every single quote seems to point to it now. It all supports it. And now there's no contradictions, there's no pieces left out. So this is what I'm going with. This is my new 2019 view of A Course in Miracles, and it does fly in the face of the established two major views of the Course, where you have to put aside those old interpretations of what is the real world. The real world actually is heaven, and you can perceive it, rather than that it's just part of a dream. It is an image in the dream because it's perceptual. The real world still is but a dream does mean I'm having a perception of reality, and that perception of reality is like an image of reality that I'm seeing. I'm seeing a visual, an image of heaven. So it is a dream because it is an image still. All perceptions are images, but it's an image of, coming from reality, and that means that the real world is a real world, and it is heaven. That's a correct label for reality. So there we go. Maybe some diagrams would help to make it clearer, but I think I've covered most of the points, the ways in which this affects how you look at things, and this is my position now going forward. So I'm going to build upon that because it seems to be very correct. So there we go. Thanks for listening if you made it this far to the end, and I've got a few more videos in the works that I've been holding off on because of the weather, but coming soon. See you, talk to you later with my giant hands. Whoa! Bye-bye.